Sige, let's record this for those who are not around or who have problem with their internet connection. So last time I sent you a video about the two independent sample t-tests. So this one is an inferential statistical tool that is used to compare, take note, two groups. Okay? Two groups yung kino-compare natin with the t-test. But you have to make sure that you will meet all the requirements or the assumptions. You will satisfy all the assumptions needed kasi in the independent sample t-test and even the paired t-test they are under parametric test. And when you say parametric test, number one, the data that you have collected should be normally distributed. Okay, normally distributed yan siya, and you can see that if you can review the video I gave you, meron doon sa just part na mag-check ka kung normally distributed ba talaga ang data niyo or hindi. When you say normally distributed, your data is most likely precise, meaning they are close with each other, they agree with each other, and you don't have outliers or extreme data. Like when you give an exam na 100 items, most of the scores will be like from 80 to 100. That's what you call normally distributed. But if merong isa or dalawa na yung score ay 10 or 15, that will be very far from the usual scores. So we call that outliers or extremes, and that will actually affect the normality of the distribution of the data. And if that's the case, hindi applicable si t-test here. Okay? Kasi again, number one, normally distributed. Tapos number two, there should be equal variances. We have two groups here for the t-test, and variances measure precision pa rin ng data. Okay? So actually, variance is the square of the standard deviation. The standard deviation is a measure of variation to check again whether your scores are close to the mean. Okay? Yun talaga ang pinaka-importante, especially if you have lots of respondents, so like 100 kabuok, dapat their answers are precise. Wala tayong outliers. Okay? And then another thing is we can just use t-test if your collected data are real numbers. Okay? Interval or ratio. Mga continuous na mga numbers. We cannot use t-test if you have collected only nominal data, yung mga merong classification like sa sex, male and female, sa occupation, medtech ba, pharmacist, nurse, etc. Walang numerical data doon. You cannot use t-test for that. Okay? So itong two independent sample t-test is used if you have two groups that are independent from each other. So like yung example nito, level of knowledge between male and female. So ang kino-compare yung level of awareness ng babae and level of awareness ng lalaki. So they are independent from each other. Iba naman yung identity ng mga lalaki, iba din yung mga babae. So independent sila, and then we are comparing things about them. In this case, that's the level of awareness. Pero again, two groups lang ha, male and female. So again, if your research requires you to use that independent sample t-test, please review my video. You can always do this na kayo lang yung gagawa, and then follow lang kung paano maggawa ng decision and ng conclusion. Para pwede din naman kayong makasave. Pwede nyo ipa-check sa akin kung tama ba yung ginawa nyo. And then ako na lang mag-sign for the statistics na part para hindi less 1,500 yung gastos ninyo. If that's the case ha, kung independent sample t-test lang naman. Do not forget our decision rule. When you're going to do the statistics, you're going to look at the p-value, and then a p-value of less than or equal to 0.05 means that there is a significant difference between the two groups. Okay? Again, pag less than 0.05 or even equal to 0.05, na ay significant difference, ha? Pero in this case kasi the p-value is 0.974, that's greater than the 0.05. So we are going to accept the null hypothesis that there is no significant difference. Wala daw significant difference ang level of awareness ng mga babae at ng mga lalaki in terms of I don't know, that's antimicrobial dispensing ata. And ito yung sinasabi ko kaninang assumption checks kasi we will also do this sa paired t-test or sa ANOVA. If we want to know the normality of the distribution, for us to be sure na yes, we can really use t-test kasi parametric test yon na satisfy natin yung normality of distribution. Pwede tayo mag-conduct ng Shapiro-Wilk test. Makikita din natin yun sa JASP. And then yung ating decision rule here is the p-value. The p-value here is higher or greater than 0.05. That means the data set is normally distributed. So yes, you can use the independent sample t-test. Okay? Yung isa pa na assumption checker is the Levin's test. Ganun pa rin. If the p-value is greater than 0.05, it means that the data set is homogeneous, the variances are equal. So dalawang assumptions yun na na-meet and tama na gagamitin si independent sample t-test. Now, kapag basing mag-ask mo, ma'am, paano kung hindi na-satisfy yung mga assumptions? The data set is not normally distributed, the variances are not equal, or meron kayong data na hindi real numbers, yes or no lang siya. Please take note that the parametric equivalent, wait lang, ipakita ko sa inyo sa JASP kasi I think hindi ko siya nasama sa last na video. This one. Yung recent file ko. E-test. E-test ba yun? Now, let me check if this is the... this is not... But anyway lang. I-try natin ito. It's the difference between experiential methods of teaching versus lecture, kung ano ba yung, kung meron ba silang difference talaga. So ito yung mga scores. Diba pag magti-t-test, click mo ito, and then independent sample t-test kasi iba naman yung group for the experiential, iba yung sa lecture. So dito yung scores, dito yung methods of teaching. And then naka-student yan siya. Look at the left side of the screen. Student yan siya, meaning independent sample t-test talaga ito. But para alam nyo lang, kung for example, hindi ma-satisfy yung mga assumption checks, the equivalent test, the non-parametric equivalent of the independent sample t-test is this one, the so-called Mann-Whitney test. And yes, it will also give you the p-value and the same decision rule. Okay? The same decision rule that if the p-value is less than 0.05, there is a significant difference. Ganun pa rin yung pag-decide sa or mag-conclude ka. Pero kailangan mo kasi talagang piliin ang tamang testing. Student t-test or independent sample t-test if you have met the parametric assumptions, while use the Mann-Whitney test kapag hindi na-meet. Okay, that's the Mann-Whitney test is known as the non-parametric equivalent of the independent sample t-test. I hope that is clear. Now let's move on. Meron ba ditong gagamit ng paired t-test? Hindi ko kasi sure. Kasi sa section B meron. So kailan natin gagamitin si dependent sample t-test or paired sample t-test? Actually, it's the same thing. Since this is still a t-test, this is still a parametric test, so you also have to meet the assumptions for the normality of distribution. Therefore, wala dapat outliers or extreme values or data. And there should be ano pa? I mean, the data set should also be continuous or real numbers. Hindi pwede dito yung nominal and ordinal types of data. So make sure that you can properly identify what type of data are you getting sa inyong data gathering procedure. Now, what's the difference between independent sample t-test and the paired t-test? Kanina sinabi ko, independent t-test is for two groups that are not related to each other. You have different sets of samples or respondents for each group. So yung babae at lalaki kanina, they have nothing to do with each other. Ang sa paired t-test kasi, the measurement will be from one group, tapos isang set of sample ka lang, pero dalawang measurements. What do I mean by that? Ito yung mga study na may mga pre-test and post-test. Okay? So like you measure, example, the blood sugar level of the subjects before giving your intervention. So your intervention can be your plant material. Now, since that is before giving the intervention, that's what we call the pre-test. And then, after giving the intervention, you will again measure the blood sugar of the subject. So that is not called the post-test. So that is related. They are paired with each other. The blood sugar of this subject before and after are being paired. Kaya paired t-test din siya. Yun ang kaibahan ni independent sample t-test and ni paired t-test. This is the formula if you are going to do a manual computation, but since I expect you to have a lot of respondents, syempre, we will not be doing the math manually. So we will be using the software. Just lang tayo ha, kasi may bayad yung SPSS and wala tayong license for that. Anyway, yung JASP is a free software, so wala tayong matatamaan na intellectual properties or any other rights ng company. Yung decision rule is the same with that of the independent sample t-test. We will look at the p-value. If it is lesser than 0.05, so you have to reject the null hypothesis. I-reject mo siya kasi merong significant difference. Okay? Pero if it's higher than 0.05, that's the time you accept the null hypothesis that there is no significant difference between the two groups. Okay? Let me give you an example. Sorry, this is, yung sa pharmacist. Pero actually, this is not purely sa pharmacist kasi ano naman ito, yung nag-conduct lang is the PPHA Davao chapter. They conducted a research training to research professors. So the objective of that training is to increase the research competence of the professors. So they gave a training, but they actually gave questionnaires before and after the training. Nag-adapt sila ng questionnaire. So kaya kung makikita niyo sa conceptual framework ng kanilang study, the independent variables is yung before and after na scores nila doon sa questionnaire. And then syempre the outcome variable or the dependent variable is the level of competence. Now, kung titingnan ang SOP, ganito yung SOP example ha for the paired t-test. What is the level of research competence of the research professors before the training? So that's before. Ano ba yung kanilang level of competence? And then second question, level of research competence after the training. So that's 2. Before and after. And then for the third one, for the inferential statistics, mag-a-ask na tayo kung meron bang difference in the level of research competence of the professors before and after the training. So this is quantitative descriptive comparative research, but this can also be applicable to experimental research class. Just look at your SOP. If meron kayo dyang before and after na measurement, you have interventions before and after, and then i-compare mo yon, most probably you will be doing paired t-test. But you have to make sure that you will meet all the assumptions for the parametric test. Okay, kailangan normally distributed ang data, and real numbers tayo dito. Ano ito? Di mo sure. What is the level of food handling practices? Asang number 1 ani? Wala lagi ang number 1. Wala na appeal. Or demographic profile lang ang number 1. Level of food handling practices. What is the estimated number of viable? Is there a relationship between the... this is relationship. Okay. Pag relationship, hindi kasali si t-test dito ha. Si t-test is ginagamit lang natin if your SOP is asking for is there a significant difference. Yan talaga yung t-test. Difference yung SOP dapat. So look at your SOP. Pero pag relationship na, we'll talk about that next time. Kasi ibang discussion din yon. But for the demographic profile, you can use both Pearson and Spearman-Raw correlation. Okay? Spearman and Pearson. Okay, sa demographic profile versus the food handling practices. And Pearson-R correlation, itong number 5. Si Pearson-R correlation kasi, parametric test yun siya. So kung ano yung isatisfy natin sa t-test na normality of distribution, real numbers, yun yung gagamitan natin ng Pearson-R. Pero yung non-parametric equivalent ni Pearson-R kasi is called the Spearman-Raw. So doon natin yun siya gagamitin sa demographic profile kasi one of your variable in the demographic, especially the demographic profile, hindi kasi siya real numbers. So like when you are asking for the sex, male and female, hindi yun siya real numbers. We will just assign numbers sa kanila though, pero hindi siya real number. So we cannot use the Pearson-R. So doon tayo sa non-parametric test called Spearman-Raw correlation. What is the staining? Terms of color intensity, visibility of blood cells, what is the significant difference between the staining? Wait lang. Ano yung makukuha nyo na data sa color intensity? May numbers ba dyan? Numerical. Okay. Numerical. Sa chart. Pero yes, result pa rin siya ng experiment. So yes, you can do the t-test here. But it is independent sample t-test. Kasi hindi kasi magkapareho yung GEMSA and yung clitoria ternity. So they are independent from each other, right? Wala ka namang pre-test and post-test dyan. So independent. How about the visibility of blood cells? Yes or no lang ito? Or meron pa rin siyang numerical data? Meron pa rin siya sa chart. Okay, independent sample t-test. Dalawang group lang naman kasi yan. You may review our recorded discussion, sa section B, nung about sa independent sample t-test. And if you have questions, you may ask me. What else? Ilang ka trials na inyong experiment? Ilang ka trials? 5. Oh, it's okay. You can use the t-test. Dali lang na inyong study ba? I mean, dali lang ang statistics. Again, let's have an example of our paired t-test. Kung merong paired t-test dito sa inyo ha. Wait lang, open ko lang. I have hypothetical data here for the research competence. Huwag niyong kalimutan ha na JASP cannot read files that are not in CSV format. So you really have to save your file. Yung file type niya dapat CSV. Kasi makalimot mo ba? Niya, kung man mag-encode niya, dili ninyo siya ma-run sa JASP. Kaya dili ninyo siya makita. Saan naman to? Wala pa na-open. Wait lang. Yung mga testing the relationships, stay put muna tayo. Okay. So this is my hypothetical data for the paired t-test. As you can see, ito yung scores nila before the training. Ito naman yung scores after the training. When you are going to encode your data for a possible paired t-test, you have to label it properly ha. So let me insert a column here. Ayan. And example, I'll write respondent number. Respondent number 1. Kasi hindi, kailangan paired talaga sila ha. If this is for respondent number 1, dapat ito talaga yung score niya before the training and ito talaga yung score niya after the training. Hindi pwede na ito yung score niya before the training test yung after niya nandito sa baba. Kaya nga siya tinawag na paired t-test kasi kailangan silang i-pair dalawa. Okay? Okay, so I have 15 subjects here and I have already saved this one in CSV format. CSV na ito. So since naka-CSV na siya, I can import this one sa JASP. So I have opened here the JASP. Remember, dito tayo mag-start sa JASP ha, sa upper left corner. Sorry. And then, let me look for the file. Nilagay ko yun siya sa research capability building. And then, ang pangalan nun ay research competence. Excuse me. Research competence. So, ayun. After that, na-import na siya. So, we have here, actually, the respondents before and after. And then, we have to make sure na tama yung type of data. So, sa respondents, actually, hindi yan siya scale. This can be nominal. Kasi this is just for the identification of the respondents. And then itong before and after, tama na ito na naka-scale sila. Kasi these are real numbers, their scores sa questionnaires before and after the intervention. And then when you're going to do the paired t-test, the same thing with the independent sample t-test, just click here sa t-test and look for the paired sample t-test. Click that. And then after, transfer the before and after. So isang lalagyan lang yan sila kasi nga pair sila. So we have before and we also have after. So yan lang yung kailangan natin. After we transfer the both of them under the variable pairs na box, you will automatically see the t-score, the degrees of freedom, and the p-value. Yung t-score, ito yung result like ng manual computation talaga. And you can also use that one in the decision you are going to make. Pero kailangan natin yung table ni t-test sa critical values. Ginagamit lang natin yun again pag nagma-manual computation tayo. But since meron naman na sa software, p-value lang yung titingnan natin. Ano yung nakalagay? P-value is, this is very small, less than 0.01. So ano nga yung ating decision rule for this? Parehas lang sila ng independent sample t-test. Reject null hypothesis if the P value is less than 0.05. So as you can see, the p-value is really less than 0.05. So we are rejecting the null hypothesis. That means there is a significant difference between the level of competence of the professors before and after the training. Meaning, merong influence, merong effect yung training sa level of competence kasi nagbago siya. Hindi na daw magkapareho ang level of competence before and after the training. That's the beauty of the paired test. Kasi we cannot just decide just by looking at their scores. Marami din yung scores na hindi tayo makapag-decide whether meron ngang pagbabago or hindi. So ito yung gamit ng ating paired sample t-test. We can also do normality check here. Kasi nga, paired sample t-test is a parametric test. So we have to make sure that the data set is normally distributed. And we have the same decision rule here. If the p-value is greater than 0.05, ano nga ito? The data set is normally distributed. Okay? Normally distributed. Wala tayong Levin's test for this one since para yun siya sa independent sample t-test. Okay? And we can also click the descriptives if we want to see the mean and the standard deviation. It will automatically give you both the means of both groups and also the standard deviation. Both are important, especially the mean is our center of distribution, and then the standard deviation will tell us how precise our collected data are. And another thing, baka magtanong din kayo kung ang independent sample t-test meron siyang non-parametric equivalent, and that is the Mann-Whitney test. Si paired t-test meron din. Kasi kapag hindi natin na-satisfy yung assumptions sa normality of distribution or hindi real numbers yung ating makokollect sa data, hindi natin pwede gamitin si paired t-test. So instead of the student, click nyo dito sa left side yung Wilcoxon signed rank. Yan yung non-parametric equivalent ni paired t-test. So you can also use this. It's very important for you to identify kung ano ba talagang test yung kailangan yung gamitin for the data analysis. So that is class, the paired t-test. I hope hindi kayo malito kailan gagamitin si independent and si paired. Si independent kapag from the word itself independent, the two groups are independent from each other. They are not related. You have different subjects or respondents for both groups. So iba yung babae, iba yung lalaki. For example lang yan. Or kung experimental man yan, yung isang group is given the positive control, and then the second group is given with your plant material. So independent sila from each other. Pero as long as two groups lang talaga, kasi two groups lang yung pwede sa t-test. Ayan, independent sample t-test. However, if the two groups are related to each other, you only have one group of respondents, you have one group of samples in the experiment. It's just that meron kang two sets of measurement or scores, yun yung time na gagamitin natin si paired t-test. So, most of the time, nagagamit siya for comparative studies or experimental studies na merong measurements before and after giving a certain intervention. It may be a drug, or in this case, this is not actually a drug, but just a training. Because the researcher just wanted to know whether the training they gave to the professor increased their level of competence. Okay, ito yung kaibahan ng dalawa. Do you have questions about the independent sample t-test and the paired t-test? Baka meron kayong gustong itanong. Though sa iba sa inyo, hindi siya applicable. Pero it's good to know actually sa research world and how are we going to do to check the difference. Kasi kung mag-masters kayo, merong research doon. Kung mag-proceed kayo sa med, may research pa rin. Para alam nyo na kung ano yung gagawin ninyo. And in our day-to-day lives, even as actually nowadays, yung statistics parating ginagamit due to the elections, we have a lot of like organizations or companies doing surveys. So, gumagamit sila ng statistical tests. Mostly lang yung nakikita natin is yung percentage kasi kung sino yung mas malaki or whatsoever. But actually, if we are going to do inferential statistics, like magka-question kayo, is there a significant difference between the votes of this one, votes sa Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao? We can actually do that as long as we have the numerical data. So we are done with the t-test and the non-parametric test ha, kasi papalitan mo lang naman talaga yung test doon sa JASP kung hindi pwedeng gamitin yung parametric. Palitan mo lang siya ng non-parametric. Pero two groups lang kasi yon. Na paano yung mga researches na maraming groups? Yan na ngayon papasok si ANOVA. Kasi ANOVA is also used to test the difference between groups. Pero take note, it's between 2 or more groups. So pag-aaralan natin yan next meeting since it's already 6:56. So maraming groups ito ha. For example, meron kayong experimental, positive control, negative control, doon napapasok si ANOVA. Hindi na pwede si t-test doon. So, i-continue natin yan siya next meeting. After the ANOVA, we'll have the discussion section of your paper para ready na kayo. After gathering your data, you are already ready to write the discussion section. And then afterwards, sa ANOVA, we will have the test for the relationship. Kasi marami sa groups dito na testing for the relationship. For the meantime, do you want to clarify something or do you want to raise a concern?